It is a true pleasure, though to be honest, pleasure isn't exactly what I'm feeling just now, but it really is an honour to be asked to deliver this talk for the Hispanists and for UCD, if not actually in UCD. UCD is where I began my life as a researcher, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Professor Don Cruikshank, who taught me how to research, and to Dr. Philip Johnston, who taught me how to write. And while I'm still learning to do both of those things, I think it's safe to say that they were really pivotal moments for me. So I am deeply grateful to both of them. I begin this lecture today focusing on a piece of theatre about feminicidio in Ciudad Juárez, a subject I have been researching, writing, teaching and learning about for many years in an attempt to disentangle the many different strands of representation of feminicidio as discourse, that's to say around violence, around gender, as well as horrifying material reality visited on the female body. Today's talk focuses on the personal experience of translation of two performance-related pieces from Latin America on sexual violence, one about and from Ciudad Juárez, and one from the extreme other end of the continent. In the first set of reflections, I focus on how the process of translation works on the bodies of women who I have previously described as figured, disfigured, fractured, fragmented, remolded, reimagined, reinvented, revictimized and revitalized, sometimes all at the same time. The second half moves to consider the problems of cultural translation of the term feminicidio in El Violador en tu Camino by the Chilean theatre group Las Tesis, and a local performance/translation of that text. In the first section, I return to work, some of which I've already written about, to reimagine it in dialogue with the second set of reflections. In this way, I go back, but also forward, moving from the personal to the collaborative, moving through different affective registers to arrive at what might be seen as a collective transnational horizon of hope. A caveat: this lecture is deeply personal. It's about my encounter with texts, my translation journey. And it's not particularly spoken from a position of authority within translation studies. It is a very personal reflection. Sometimes I am in an encounter with these texts on my own, and sometimes in the company of others. Not quite a piece of auto-theory as articulated so eloquently by Laurent Fournier in her recent book, but unapologetically personal all the same. And that presents considerable challenges when speaking into a void, as I'm doing today. I hope that you can stay with me while I try to argue that the cognitive, political and affective encounter with words that name deeply personal and traumatic experiences can in turn activate a profound recognition of structural and systemic violences. Before I begin properly, I also feel it important to signal that the texts that are the subject of my analysis today are about rape and violent death, subjects that are wounding and will resonate whoever listens to them in vastly different ways. I will read words that are painful to listen to, but I hope that it is done with due attention and care to the subjects of which they speak, and in a spirit of solidarity and carefulness. So I'm going to start with a theatre text about feminicidio in Ciudad Juárez called Mujeres de Arena. And this section is entitled Here in the Desert, Fear is Precise. This is a phrase from the French-Canadian writer Nicole Brossard, whose wonderful feminist novel Mauve Désert, published in 1987, acted as a kind of melancholic counterpoint on my journey through the translation of Mujeres de Arena. It was not a random choice. She was referenced in an article by Elena Basile, which proved immensely useful to me when translating the play. I then tracked it down, and I found it kept coming back. Why? Well, in part because she writes a novel, a feminist utopia set in the desert of Arizona in which a woman is murdered, so an obvious resonance, and also because it is an experimental fiction théorique that contains a book, a story about the translator who finds the book, and the translation of that book. In all of these ways, it seemed to suggest itself as a reflective echo of sorts, and signals a broader interest of mine which lies in rethinking the relationship between earlier feminist discourses of the 80s and the 90s in order to bring them into dialogue with scholarship and activism of today. So back with Brossard, where here in the desert, fear is precise. I've spoken and written elsewhere of the centrality of the desert space to the conceptualization of violent death that is captured by the extreme cruelties of feminicidio. Mujeres de Arena by playwright Humberto Robles forms part of this body of work and is probably the best known theatrical response to feminicidio in that city. An award-winning documentary piece of theatre, it was first staged for the Día de No Violencia contra las Mujeres y las Niñas in 2002 in Mexico City's main square, and has since played extensively throughout many of the Mexican states and also beyond its borders. You can access it in digital format in Spanish, German, French, Italian and English translations, and I'm showing you a snapshot of the website here. The play integrates the testimony of different victims and their families. Written as 10 distinct scenes, it attempts to breathe life into 4 real victims of feminicidio from Ciudad Juárez: Natalia in scene 2, Micaela in scene 4, Lilia Alejandra in scene 6, and Erendira in scene 9. It intersperses these stories with commentary on the context and other narratives about the crimes, mixing poetic fragments, monologue, newspaper reports, letters, elegies, diary, and music to create what Eugenia Muñoz likens to an orchestral score. A series of leitmotifs and narrative devices are also employed to crystallize the political messages, including a series of rhetorical hooks that signal entry into diverse scenarios that re-narrativize the crimes. The play's identification of the systemic nature of the feminicidal violence in operation works to locate the crimes within wider narratives about neoliberalism and gore capitalism, and here I'm drawing from the work of Sayak Valencia, as well as necropolitical regimes of power inspired by Achille Mbembe and the many others in the region who have taken on his ideas. These motifs are all present in the testimony of Lilia Alejandra Garcia Andrade's sister Maria Luisa, or Malu, in scene 6, which relates in chilling terms the extent of Liliana's ordeal at the hands of her 3 attackers, and where the darkness of feminicidal violence expressed throughout the play receives its most explicit theatrical treatment. This segment then focuses on the slow process of doing violence to the body. It records the progressive, escalating steps of pain, commencing with Lilia's abduction, taking the audience slowly through her being beaten and tied up, through the burning, the raping, the biting, the torturing, finally to reach the killing stage. So who was Lilia Alejandra? Nancy Pineda Madrid argues that the case of Lilia Alejandra in 2001 represented somewhat of a turning point in a feminicidal saga that had been ongoing since the early 1990s in Juárez. Notwithstanding the multiple turning points that have supposedly happened in the histories of feminicidio in that city, and of which more in a moment, the facts of her case seemed brutally simple when her body was found wrapped in a blanket in a lote baldío, the so-called vacant lots that peppered Juárez's urban landscape, next to the Centro Comercial Soriano, directly across from the headquarters of the Maquila Industry Federation. The location mattered. It had the effect of cementing, in the public's mind at least, the connections between the infamous assembly plants and the deaths of the young women in the city. Lilia Alejandra had been strangled to death, and her body displayed signs of torture and sexual violence, including rape. Following this crime, her mother, Norma Andrade de Garcia, along with the mothers of 6 other victims, founded the organization Nuestras Hijas de Regreso a Casa, and here you can see Norma on the left-hand side of the image. With an unprecedented media frenzy surrounding her case, the details around the specific nature of the violence enacted on the body became central to Lilia's story. As Norma noted, "When we found her, my daughter's body told of everything that had been done to her." And sadly, just in the last few weeks, there have been circulation of events online that commemorate the 20th anniversary of Lilia Alejandra's death. Her mother remains also a committed activist. To return to the tipping point, unfortunately this was not to be, and it's worth pointing out here that there have been many so-called tipping or turning points when it comes to feminicidio's narrative arc. We could mention the case of Iris, the 7-year-old child killed with unspeakable cruelty in 2005, or we could reference 2 cases in Mexico City that prompted mass strikes in 2020 just before global lockdown. Ingrid Escamilla, whose killer circulated pictures of her body online, and a 7-year-old child called Fatima. Or we could talk about another child called Fatima, age 12, murdered in 2015 in the Estado de Mexico, a site that rapidly took over from Ciudad Juárez as feminicidio's ground zero. I have written elsewhere of feminicidio's reiterative capacity and argue that repetition remains its central defining logic. The only sure thing about feminicidio is that another is about to happen, indeed, if it is not happening already. In order to situate my translation of Lilia's story in scene 6, and which I undertook without looking at the very excellent version online, and my version shares many similarities with that version, and also there are differences. I should point out, though, that my experience of the play consists of viewing performances of it online in Spanish. After a year of pandemic time in which no one has been at a performance of anything, I'm acutely conscious that this is the only mode of encounter available to any of us. Sharing this with you now is to emphasize that my relationship with the text involves a negotiation, a mediation, and a traversing of the necessary distances that lie between me and the narrated subjects, and that are shaped by different lines of class, geography, ethnicity, language, and history. It is not my intention here to rehearse arguments around the ambiguities of transnational witnessing in depth, simply to point out that the construction of any kind of empathic encounter is fraught with tensions around agency, victimhood, and the helplessness of a first world witness also positioned as consumer. What follows, therefore, is an attempt to think through the negotiation of these tensions through reflecting on my own bodily and affective experience during the process of translating Lilia's story. Through this, I am trying to test the ways in which translation, seen through the lens of Spivak's famous description of it as the most intimate act of reading, projects you into an encounter with the source experience in a way that, to quote Nicole Brossard again, forces us onto the scene. And in this next section, I'm going to force you, the audience, onto the scene in the way that Brossard imagines, by showing you an extract of scene 6 spoken by two characters called second and fourth woman. I want you to imagine your daughter or your sister or your cousin or your girlfriend or your wife. Imagine that they leave home to go to work or to school. Imagine how nice they look as they go on their way with their faces full of innocence. Imagine that on their way home a car blocks their path and 3 men get out. Imagine that they take her to a house and force her into one of the rooms. There they throw her to the floor while the 3 men look at her terrified face. Imagine that one of the men ties her up and forces her onto a table. Imagine that she tries to resist, to defend herself. He raises his arm, clenches his fist and hits her on the nose. Then he raises his arm again to hit her on the mouth so that she can no longer say. We return again to the character called second woman, who says, imagine this young woman saying these words while she is being beaten and raped, saying them in a voice that is broken and with tears rolling down her face. And imagine that when the rape stops, it doesn't stop there. No, the suffering continues, because in the bedroom there are 2 more men. One of them comes over to her and burns her arms with his cigarette. He starts to bite her breasts to rape her, and the 3 men torture her. When they finish, they throw her to the floor and start to kick her. After that, they leave her on the floor, covered in blood, raped and degraded in the cruelest, most sadistic way you can imagine. She remains there in pain and agony for a day, 2 days, 3 days, until they realize she can take no more and they decide to kill her. Imagine that one of them puts his hands around her neck and strangles her. In spite of everything that has happened to her, she tries to resist but has no strength left, and he achieves his goal. He kills her. But this is not enough for the other 2 men, and one of them takes her roughly by the face and breaks her neck. And so there she lies, her nose broken, her lips swollen, her eyes bruised and beaten, her arms burnt with cigarettes, her legs full of scars, her wrists bearing marks from where she has been tied, and her breasts gnawed as if by animals. They roll her body in a blanket and take it to the car. They drive to one of Ciudad Juarez's many deserted wastelands and throw her body there. This section is entitled Digging into Words Without Defiling Graves. In some ways, the questions posed by the showing and telling of Lilia's ordeal epitomise the ethics of representation of feminicidal discourse in Juarez, and indeed resonate in a wider frame. How can the experience of bodily pain be conveyed through voice and movement? And how can the gulf between showing and telling, the time-honoured tension between the indexical and the iconic, be properly excavated? In acknowledgement of the difficulties, Humberto Robles makes the text widely available through assigning copyleft to groups or individuals to use the text for the purpose of furthering the pursuit of social justice. Returning to the text and the subjunctive mode of engagement suggested by the use of the hook, imagine if, imagine if, imagine if, we are reminded that there is always a subject position in translation, and indeed, as has been widely documented, the field of translation studies has witnessed an unprecedented foregrounding of the translator's subjectivity in both translation practice and theory. We can see that this holds whether the translator has become, following Mona Baker's work, an active participant in producing cultural realities, or following Elena Basile, a self-conscious agent of cultural change, thoroughly aware of his or her political responsibilities and ideological positioning vis-à-vis both source and target language. In consonance with Basile, however, and if I am to recognise that my position involves my solidarity with the content and message of the play, as well as an appreciation of its politics, then it also involves grappling with what she evocatively names, and I quote, the affective vicissitudes that accompany, quoting again, the traumatic temporality of the translator's defining acts of rereading and rewriting the message of the other in another language or culture. According to her thinking, the affective work of the translator becomes akin to a process of working through trauma, to use Dominic Lecapra's term, and, quoting again, which constitutes the translator's inaugural mode of engagement with the other's text. Thinking about my translation in Basile's terms as an inaugural mode of engagement with the other means that the boundary between the text and its meanings when filtered through the translation process will, quoting again, always need to be negotiated on the translator's own thinking body. If I take this as a point of departure, I wonder about the effect on my own thinking body, translating as a body, to use Carol Mayer's terms, when faced with the challenge of translating lines like the ones you have on screen here. As a diligent and committed linguist, I spend time with these words. I look up the various ways that I might translate él empieza a morder sus senos, or more abstract phrases like aún no termina el martirio de la joven. I also wonder how my translation, he starts to rape her, can convey any of the weight of the experience and have similar concerns about the flat description, y así los tres hombres la torturan. We might reflect further on the ways in which the telling of the story of Lelia already participates in her erasure through the flatness of the pronouns, the third-person narration, among many other elements. In this regard, the translator further participates in this process of making her invisible, making her more dead, and perhaps it is here that I most acutely perceive the wisdom of Spivak when she talks about feminist translation and, I quote, bludgeoning someone else. I continue to grapple with the text's multiple challenges. I investigate the various possible interpretations of the verb desnucar. In the Spanish, the prefix des already seems aggressive to me, signaling the way in which the nuca is broken violently away from the body. In comparison, breaks her neck seems a rather tame interpretation. This process also involves the translator looking at the positionality of these words in the sentence, at the way they make meaning on the page. I consider 2, sometimes 3, 4 different alternatives, checking in the dictionary, reading and rereading. There is more. Moving in, through and around the words as they evolve on the page involves a certain kind of relationship with the experience they name and contain. The conventional distance between words and the way my brain receives and mediates them is distorted and remapped. Like a series of cognitive synapses or sparks inside my head, I am compelled to find ways to talk about the biting of breasts, the strangling, the multiple enduring rapes, the torture. I search for ways to render the experiences of Lily Alejandra as legible, but also bearable in my own tongue. Forced to find suitable formulas of words, the translator is inserted into a relationship with Lilia, not into her experience, of course, but into a relationship with the words that name it. Throughout this time, my heart races, and I think of Leah Hill's words about how after translation you have to, and I quote, learn how to breathe again. I also remember Brian Masumi's words, the skin is faster than the word as my body experiences the quintessential goosebumps. I feel sick and have to pause. Catherine Boyle, in her wonderful article A Feminist Translates, says of translating words that, and I quote, naming them in another language makes them appear in our world and they start to come into focus. Inspired by the process described by Boyle, I can attest to the ways in which the encounter with the words of Lilia's trauma do manage to make them appear in my world, to force a recognition of my own vulnerability and openness to the possibility of sexual violence. I say this not because the deep structures of patriarchy suddenly become apparent through the unveiling of their most despicable practices. Rather, I see how the words function as end products in the way Peter Brook imagines them, and through which they begin as, I quote, an impulse to become a small visible portion of a gigantic unseen formation. I interpret this gigantic formation as the system that produces violence on Lilia's body, which, following Boyle, comes powerfully into focus. In this way, through the cognitive connections with the words that provoke the body's affective responses, the very systemic violence that begets feminicidio, made up of its many complex factors, including misogyny, hegemonic masculinity, and the grotesque extremes of late capitalism, merges into view and is felt on the surface through the goosebumps and in the interior of my body through the racing of my heart. This systemic violence is part of Lilia's story, but it is also part of mine. Indeed, this continuum of violence against women is reinforced, a violence we understand, which of course happens over here as well as over there, a point made by Marianne Franks in her discussion of Adorno, and one that seems almost unnecessary to verbalise given the charged and emotional response to Sarah Everhard's death in the past few weeks. I do not mean to collapse those lines of difference that separate us. Rather, I argue that through the forced proximity to the words that name Lilia's erasure and degradation, the concept of violence against women as systemic, embedded in language and known in the body, comes into focus and is activated by and through the translation process. This encounter, the somatic, deep time work with systemic violence and the bodily affects it produces, in turn produces and provokes fear, guilt, and indeed a certain paralysis. This fear surrounds the task of translation itself, the fear of what the words will do to you, expressed by Brossard when she says, "How am I to believe for a single moment that the landscapes in you won't erase those in me?" This fear of erasure through immersion in the source text makes us think about how translation hastens this merging. As Brossard says, true landscapes loosen the tongue in us, flow over the edge of our thought frame. They settle into us. I realise that this landscape has also settled into me, that this woman in the sand takes me to the sand that I know, that belonging to the coasts of the south of Ireland where I live and the west of Ireland where I grew up. When aged 15, I also found a woman's body in the sand, in Atlantic sand, when still in school and during my lunch break. In such a way, the experience of the mutilated other body settles into this translator's body and affects an awakening, a new realisation of that experience through the cognitive, bodily and affective processes of transmission. This dialogic shift, and I call it a shift rather than a transformation, it means in Esther Pierin's terms, and I quote, being aware of and acting upon one's entanglements in the present with other places, times, matters and meaning, or what Karen Barad calls space-time mattering. Through the tongue loosening then, an encounter is enabled that ruptures, if just a little, the distance between us, as I am compelled to use words that mean that I too am a female subject to threats of sexual violence, exposed also to women's bodies in the sand. Mujeres de Arena, it hardly needs stating, is about the violent obliteration of a woman's body, a crime named in the region as feminicidio. I return to this word by way of linking to the next set of reflections which I want to bring to bear on another personal experience, that of translating and then performing a version of the by now globally famous El Violador en tu Camino, first performed in the opposite end of the continent to Ciudad Juarez, and in which a very different kind of dynamic of space-time mattering can be discerned. The story of El Violador will be familiar to this audience, and Deborah Martin and Deborah Shaw's recent article on it presents an invaluable overview of its origins and an innovative reading of its transnational impact. Performed by Chilean feminist theatre collective Las Tesis, it featured as part of the Día de No Violencia contra la Mujer en Valparaíso, Chile, in November 2019. It was soon picked up and reimagined in multiple locations around the world, and Martin and Shaw's article presents a robust analysis of certain key performance sites in Mexico, New York, and Turkey. Our project came about as an intersection between theatre studies practitioners, students and teachers, the Sexual Violence Framework Project and the Gender Violence Conflict Cluster that I'm involved in the Centre for Advanced Studies in Languages and Cultures. It was in flash mob form, and its primary distinguishing feature from all of the other performances to date was our investment in and commitment to performing it multilingually, and which in the end bore fruit as a rendition in 13 different languages: Spanish, English, Irish, Basque, Galician, Catalan, Portuguese, Italian, French, German, Polish, Danish and Korean. The project presented many challenges. not least that of rendering in English that would be palatable for a local context. Thus, various tweaks to the already existing versions in English crept into the fashioning of the script. The process of translation was both collective and collaborative. It emerged organically from a group of very busy women, including Ciara Broderick, Roisin O'Gorman, Emer Clifford, and many changes happened by chance, or through rushed emails, or WhatsApp messages, as well as during rehearsal. Let me give you a flavour of the close to final script given to participants as it emerged. And I'm not going to take you through every word of this. You'll be very familiar with the Spanish version on the far side, and this is a sense of the version as we delivered it to our audience in English, along with a few of the stage directions. Continuing here to show you obviously the original Spanish version, and here our rendering of it in English, and you can see that we didn't translate the term feminicidio when rendering the version into English, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. Taking you now to the very well-known refrain of this performance and the chorus, Y la culpa no era mía, ni donde estaba, ni como vestía, and a sampling of some of the languages that we staged it in, including Irish, Nemishes Chianti Lesh, Nomachuids AD, English, It's Not My Fault, Not Where I Was, Not What I Wore, and two versions that I'm not actually going to attempt to verbalize, but Polish and Basque. You can see also that we finished it with this statement, my place, my voice, my body, my choice, as a way of forging a very direct connection between the performance in Ireland to the previous performances and back to its origin in Chile, by linking with activism around the repeal, the 8th referendum, and which had seen an enormous activist impulse in Ireland, many of whom were present as part of our performance. So now, loosening the tongue. In this section called Loosening the Tongue, it is on the translation conundrum presented by the word feminicidio that occurs in the source text that I wish to turn by way of connecting to what we've just seen in Mujeres de Arena and to extend the reflections around transcultural translation processes. As you can see from what I've shown you, the initial part of the text was performed in Spanish, but when I attempted to perform it, I struggled with the syllables. I simply couldn't make them fit the rhythm. I practiced with my colleagues, but to no avail. I asked myself some questions about this. Why could I, who had been researching this for years and written a book about feminicidio, and who had retained the Spanish term quite deliberately in the title of that book as a way of forcing English-speaking audiences to grapple with concepts for which they had no words, why could I not enunciate it for a performance which would go some way to communicating its horror in an unfamiliar context? Feminicidio. Feminicidio. Many of you here will be familiar with the history of the term. A brief summary serves to remind us that it emerged as the most appropriate cultural translation of the lived reality of the crime in societies subjected to extreme levels of violence against women. Marcela Lagarde de los Rios, anthropologist, activist, politician, is credited with coining the term, and her tenacious activism led directly to legislation in Mexico in 2007 guaranteeing the rights of women to a life free of violence. There were many others who had grappled with the term before Lagarde, including those who suggested the alternative term feminicidio, and all attempts at theorising had concluded that femicide, the English word attributed to Diana Russell's work, and which is of course defined as the killing of women because they are women, in other words referring to the gender of the victim of the crime, made no sense as femicidio. Rather, consensus emerged around the term feminicidio as the only possible translation of that act, stating that feminicide is not a word, but rather a theory. A theory, and here I quote Lagarde, about crimes that enjoy social impunity, that are incubated in misogyny, in machismo, in the disrespect for women's lives, in brutal inequality, in low salaries, in exclusion. All of that is a theory of feminicide. Feminicide is not a word, it is an entire theory. Taking this into consideration, it's hardly surprising that it's hard to pronounce, especially given the differentiated theoretical understandings of feminicidio. To cite one example, some scholars see the implication of the state as critical to feminicidio's determining logic, others do not. What all concur is that feminicidio insists on both the structural and the systemic dimensions, as well as on a spectrum approach to violence against women, and that locates feminicidio at its most extreme end. This then is the theoretical contribution from the women of the global south that I was anxious to register in my performance, even if it tripped awkwardly or even refused to come off my tongue. Taking refuge again in insights from Mauve Désert, in that space where the tongue has already been loosened and whose translator talks of jaw block, something akin to what I am experiencing, I detect the need to search, and I quote from Brossard, the wrong side of words with a hint of panic, the double edge, when the scene seemed too cruel or false. And so I wondered, in vocalizing the term, what does the additional syllable add? What does it mean? Does it stand in for systemic violence? Capture those violent structures of power that are brutally revealed through the crime? Or is the syllable simply a sign of excess, that notion so central to feminicidio as it has come to be understood in the region, not just death, but sadistic death, death that is more than death, death, as we have seen, that involves the most despicable extremes of cruelty? Does it seek to encapsulate the disciplinary violence of which Rita Laura Segato, Sayak Valencia and Rosana Reguillo, among many others, speak of when they theorize the complexities of feminicidio? Or is it there to counter the long acknowledged deacousmatization of female voices in public spaces, but also, of course, in theatre? Perhaps the extra syllable evokes the afterlives of feminicidio, the victim blaming, the victim shaming, the impunity, the indifference, the silence, filling the void with an extra sound. Or can't we just leave it out, I thought? Omission, the translator's best friend, the option we went for in the end. Like before with Mujeres de Arena, I continue to worry about the limitations of translation to forge the kind of coalitional solidarities and alliances across borders, to bring about the kind of crossing over that Maria Lugones frames, a crossing over without taking over. Surely a transnational collective reimagining of a shared non-violent future is threatened by the existence of a word that nobody understands or can pronounce and that names a reality that is indecipherable. What is more, is the extra noise of the additional syllable in feminicidio simply part of its broader dilemma, as on the one hand highly visibilized and acousmatized, taking up lots of airtime, and on the other silenced and unheard? I have written elsewhere of the dichotomies of feminicidal discourse, the abyss between silence and noise. We see it increasingly. The shouts of anger, the screams of El Violador, the marching, the defacement of walls, seemingly unstoppable, the destruction of property, and yet it continues unabated, its reiterative capacity undimmed, always there. And here, as a brief aside, I would say that one of the best known and most prolific writers and activists on the question of feminicidio in English is a woman called Alice Driver, whose work I admire hugely. And she has concluded that there's simply no point in trying to engage an English-speaking audience with attempts to talk of feminicide or feminicidio. This contemplation of the additional syllable, the extra sound, brought me rather circuitously to a recent beautiful meditative essay by the Mexican writer Cristina Rivera Garza that she wrote on the experience of visiting Gloria Anzaldua's grave in Hidalgo, Texas, and where she encounters this inscription. Initially disconcerted, Rivera Garza is perplexed that the tilde from sonar has been vanished, omitted, and wonders if it is yet another trick of Nepantla, Anzaldua's well-known conceptualization of the land of the in-between, where seeing double is not only possible but inevitable, as she says, one more sign that we are on the border. She comes to realize, however, that sonar wildly is exactly opposite for what she is seeing, hearing, and experiencing. And I quote, right there in that immediacy, the absence of the tilde is on the N on Gloria Anzaldua's gravestone is not a mistake, but a door. The objective is to sonar, to sound, to ring, to reverberate, to become an echo, to turn up the volume of her voice that is many voices, the voices of my mother and her sisters, the voices of the daughters of cotton, the multiplying voices of the border, ni una más. And on reading this, finally the extra syllable made sense. It was to turn up the volume, to register death sonically, to force speakers in other parts of the world to stop, to listen, to be perplexed, to ask, forcing people to add the syllable, to say the unfamiliar word, was somehow to confront the horror. And thus I realised that the awkwardness of feminicidio was the point, and that the sound it generated in a language unfamiliar was also necessary to the bridge building and the crossing over that a transnational coalitional impulse demands. That the unapologetic, dishevelled presence of more than one language was a political necessity, not just a good intention or a creative experiment. And this in turn brings me to the multilingualism of our violador, its imperfect, multilingual messiness. What the audience thought about our version rendered in 13 languages, I have no idea, but I do know that the university's media and communications team edited all but the English version out of their recording. As depressing a gesture as you could possibly imagine to a team invested emotionally in an open plurilingualism. Here again we might discern that the awkwardness of the repetitive multilingualism of the performance was its point, and not just to make the obvious parallel with the repetitive nature of gender-based violence. Rather, I like to think that the multilingual performance of violador enacts a threading up of words across borders, embodying relationality in a way that connects to Edouard Glisson's wonderful work, The Poetics of Relation. There is much to learn from Glisson's own highly creative use of language as a way of extending notions of understanding across borders. The translator's notes to Glisson's The Poetics of Relation attest to the complexities of translating his rich verbal landscape. Rejecting what he sees as the appropriative and extractive dimension of the word comprendre as grasping rather than understanding, Glisson instead opts for the word complex donner avec to connote an idea of donner as generosity of perception, with avec both reflecting back on the com of comprendre and defining the underlying principle of relation. Betsy Wing, the translator, alights on the phrase gives out and with as an unwieldy approximation, but noting, and I quote, that unfamiliar tools are always awkward. Here then is perhaps the real essence of our violador as that which can be given out and with, an embodiment of theory in practice and in process, enacting a translingual relationality across time and space. Here too the decolonial theorist Gabriella Veronelli can help us to understand language as pivotal to the work of coloniality and multilingualism as an essential tool in its deactivation. There's not time here, of course, to delve into the philosophical and linguistic criteria that emerged in the 16th century to classify and organise language into inferior and superior taxonomies, and so strikingly outlined by her in her treatise on coloniality and language. Suffice to say that she argues that multilingualism is the mode through which decolonial perspectives can be activated and a transformative energy sustained. An energy that can help to unsettle, unlearn and unseat those narratives that dispossess and maim and erase. Seen through this lens, our decentering of English as the vehicle for communication, our mixing of languages from across the globe, our foregrounding of multiple minority languages including Irish but also Gallego, Basque, Catalan, as well as the most dominant of the migrant languages in Ireland, Polish, contributed to the disordered cacophony and enhanced sense of chaos that is essential to the project of decolonisation. A poetics of relationality is always multilingual, latent, open, endlessly conjectural, to return to Glisson. Following this, translation does indeed, and going back to Brossard one last time, force us onto the scene, bludgeoning us, to use Spivak's term again, to participate in a reframing, rereading and rewriting of experiences of women on a continent far from ours. We might see this forcing onto the scene synthesised through Patrick Duggan's idea of being there in his conceptualisation of the way which trauma works in performance, or we might view it as a process of becoming co-owners of the traumatic event in the same way as memorably imagined by Doris Laub when she speaks of, I quote, the vicissitudes of listening. In turn, this enables us to be attentive to the political urgency of translation as a mode of entry into the experiences of those other bodies as we construct what Emmett Mergoon calls, and I quote, transgressive contact zones within which empowering transnational encounters can take place. I want to end with the words of Rosie Braidotti. We were very fortunate in the last couple of weeks to have had a conversation with Braidotti in which she energised us with her talk of an affirmative ethics and the possibility of constructing a collective horizon of hope. I take comfort from her words in thinking through these global dilemmas and our own ethical responsibility, as indeed Judith Butler cautions us to do. Feminist activist translation, such as that envisioned in the two examples today, particularly those efforts that work transversally through multiple languages with differentiated power bases, can form an axis of affirmation in Braidotti's terms towards the creation of transnational and translinguistic alliances. Whether this happens through the expansive gesture of Donner avec, or through Rivera Garza's door of sonic possibility, or within Braidotti's comforting vision of hope, the potential of feminist translation and its generative energy should not be underestimated. Indeed, it is only through the strengthening of that emergent sense of coalition, that steady work of resilient survival, to quote Anne Kvetkovich, that we can chart a pathway of resistance against the structural violences that cross all of our lives. Thank you so much for your attention today.